Well, good evening, scholars. Good to see everybody again tonight. Thank you for coming out. We've had a little bit of a staggered start so far with the weather, a couple of times keeping us from being together, but man, it does my heart a lot of good to see everybody out tonight. Thank you for being a part of this study. I'm really excited to continue it tonight. We have a handout tonight that should, if you've been maybe missing a class or two, that should catch you up to most everything, just the major points that we've been over. We probably talked about some other things in class, but I don't remember what they were. If you got the handout, you're doing okay. So we'll continue to update and add to the handout as the term goes on. So what I always recommend that you do is what one of my favorite teachers always made me do for class for a grade, but he would give us notes, and then we were required each week required to have a big 3-ring binder, and each week we would add the notes to that and then add our own notes to the class notes. But maybe what you might want to think about doing is getting some kind of folder or 3-ring binder or something like that you can continue to update the notes with. One little piece of housekeeping. John's too humble to talk about it, but Antioch Church of Christ is having a gospel meeting March 21st through 24th. Guess who the speaker is? John Vaughn. And you know, and I know, he's going to do an outstanding job. And he always speaks truth, and we're so very thankful for it. And the man of the hour, Andrew Tomlin, is also going to be leading singing at that particular meeting. So that starts March 21st. And so we will want to, say a word or two about that again before the time comes. But just mark your calendar. I would love to go to a gospel meeting. Wouldn't you? I mean, I'm going to come to this. What a good thing. Just think about last year and just nobody being able to get together, and now things are beginning to turn in another direction. So we're really glad for it. Okay, class, what is those of you who were here last week, what is the very first Bible translation? What was the very first Bible translation? Does anybody remember from our discussion? What is the first translation of the Bible? What? Very good. Septuagint. And that is a very, very important thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Septuagint tonight. We'll get a little bit into manuscript evidence tonight, and we'll talk a lot more about that next week, Lord willing. Tonight's going to be a little different lesson. It might be a little technical. You might be bored by it, but it's one of those kind of Bible, points of interest that I find interesting and fascinating. But what we did last week is we talked about the traditional 3-part division, the traditional 3 divisions of the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody remember what those were? Does anybody remember what those were? Torah was the first one. What's the next one? Nevi'im, very good. That's the second one, which means prophets. And then does anybody remember what the last section was? Ketuvim, very good, very good. You guys got all 3. You get a gold star for the night. So you take those 3 Hebrew letters, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, T, N, and then in this case, we'll put a CH to it. And that is where we get the word Tanakh. The Tanakh is what is normally, that's the designation given to describe the Hebrew Bible. And this is the traditional 3 sections that, Jesus and all of his followers, they would have thought of the Bible in terms of these 3 major sections. And so the very first time that the Hebrew Bible was translated was with the Septuagint. And so these are, you see up on the screen now, these are those traditional 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. The Torah, which is the law or instruction, Nevi'im, which is prophets, and then the rest of the Bible is classified with what is called the writings. And if you will look on, let's see where this is here. Okay, the top of page 7 of your outline, that is going to have that information about the Tanakh, the top of page 7. And then if you'll flip over to page whatever that is, 10, you'll see this screenshot on the outline itself. So let's talk a little bit about the Greek Septuagint and then New Testament. The reason Greek is so important to our faith, and the reason that the Septuagint and the New Testament the reason Greek proliferates at all is because of the conquest of Alexander the Great, which led to the widespread use of Greek throughout the Mediterranean world. And so you're talking about from 900 to 330 BC. Remember, those years count in that direction because we're headed towards the time of Christ. But from 900 years before Christ down to 330 years before Christ, Greek was classified, it was a type of Greek known as classical Greek. And really the only illustration I can think of to kind of help us to understand that is just to think about the difference between Elizabethan English. You ever been reading Shakespeare or some type of writing like that? And the difference between that and modern English. It's still the same language, but there are definitely some differences, right? Differences in spelling, differences in pronunciation, differences in word meanings sometimes even, but it's still very closely related. And then from roughly about 330 years before the time of Jesus to 330 years after the time of Jesus is the period where there is used what is known as Koine Greek. Let's all say that together. Koine. Koine means common. So it's sort of a common way of speaking. There's nothing flowery about it. There's nothing really fancy about it. It's just, normal way of speaking the way that we would speak. That's what they would have classified in their time as Koine Greek. And so when we come to the writings of the Septuagint and the New Testament, guess what type of Greek we're talking about? Which one? It's got to be Koine, because this is the time in which Jesus and the apostles lived and wrote. So the very first translation of the Hebrew Old Testament was the Greek translation, the Septuagint, adopted by many Christians in the Mediterranean world. And so last week we talked a lot more about this in detail. I'll just review it very quickly here. I believe this is in your notes, but Alexandria, Egypt was the birthplace of the Septuagint. Does anybody remember why Alexandria was the birthplace of the Septuagint? Anybody remember that? Why would this be the place where they would translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek in Alexandria, Egypt? More Jews lived in Alexandria, Egypt than in any other place on planet Earth except for the city of Jerusalem. And so you had such a huge Greek population there, they decided that they wanted an Old Testament. They would not have called it Old Testament, but they wanted a Bible that was in their language, the common language of the people. That's a very important point to note. And so what happened was the Hebrew Scriptures were translated into Greek about 250 years before the time of Jesus. And it was translated by 70 translators, according to the legend. We'll round the number. Some say 72. And so the reason that it is called the Septuagint is because Septuagint comes from the Latin word meaning 70. And so in my notes, which you'll also read about the Septuagint, I think that's also on page 7. Somebody can help me with that. But in the notes, when it talks about the Septuagint, am I right about that, page 7? Okay. You'll see the little abbreviation LXX. And so in a lot of writings, once they mention the Septuagint, from thereafter they'll have in parenthesis LXX, and that's how you would designate that you're talking about the Septuagint. So the legend is, it comes from the letter of Aristeas, that the Torah was translated in this story. It's a legendary story. And we talked a lot. We actually read an excerpt from that last week. Now, I want to talk about this a little more because the two most important works for biblical students that resulted from the spread of Greek from the 3rd century before Jesus to the 1st century, the two most important works are the Septuagint and the New Testament. Both of these writings benefited and they proliferated precisely because Greek was such a common language. And everybody, regardless of their culture and background, knew this as a common tongue. And so I'm reminded a little bit of, Galatians 4:4, at just the right time, Christ was sent into the world. Lots of other factors go into that verse, but I think we would have to say at the very least, Greek being such a unifying language had to have been one of those things. Okay. What I want to do for just a minute, though, is I want us to put on our thinking caps. And this is the part where you might get a little bored. And you're like, I think I was bored already. Maybe so. But what I want to do tonight is I want to talk a little bit about this issue of Jesus and his teaching ministry and the disciples and their teaching ministry. And I want to think a little bit about, have you ever heard someone say in a Bible class, or maybe a teacher at some point say that the original Gospels were written in Aramaic? Has anybody ever heard this before? And then translated from Aramaic into Greek. I want to talk about that just a little bit because I have a very strong opinion about this. And I think it's important for us to think about it for a number of reasons. All right, so let's everybody turn in our Bibles to John 19 and verse 20 for just a moment. And I want us to see something important from the scene of the death of Jesus that will set the stage. We looked at it a little bit before. Someone read for the class John 19, verse 20. Read it loudly also for those online. Maybe they'll be able to hear you. Anybody? Somebody.
This title, then will read many of the Jews, the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. And it is written in Hebrew, in Greek, and Latin.
Okay, and what was the title? Does anybody remember? Written above the cross. Yeah. Okay, so this is very important. So we have here in John 19 and verse 20, the presence of three languages. So we have here in John 19 and verse 20, the presence of three languages. What are they? They are Hebrew, what else? Greek and Latin. Okay, so in the words of Joseph Fitzmyer, the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that a trilingualism existed in Palestine in the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era. What's he saying? Translate that for us, folks, into common language. What does he say? Yeah, most people were very able to interact with three languages. And which of those would have been the most common? You already know the answer, right? So let's talk about one of those very briefly. I don't remember if we talked about Latin last week or not, but let's talk about Latin for a moment. Latin was a language that was used a lot in settings where the Romans were writing official documents, or if you were traveling along and you went to a Roman building that was an official building, it might have a Latin title to the building on the outside of the building. My understanding is that for the most part in the 1st century in the time of Jesus, that Latin was not used by the Romans as much as Greek was, which is an important and interesting thought. But it was used for official documents, governmental purposes, primarily by the Romans. And it becomes a very important language later because a scholar by the name of Jerome, whom we'll talk about a little later, produced a translation of the Bible in the last part of the 4th century called the Latin Vulgate. Has anybody ever heard of the Latin Vulgate before? Does anybody know what the Latin meaning of Vulgate means? We have a word that stems from it. Does anybody want to take a guess what our word is that stems from Vulgate? Vulgar. And what does that mean? To us it means something gross now. To them back then it meant common. So Jerome produces a translation of the Bible that is written in a language for his people in his time. But that's on down the line. We'll talk about that when we get to it. We've already talked about Aramaic, and I want to say just a passing word about it. Because Aramaic was the spoken language amongst the Hebrew people in the time of Jesus. And so they would talk to each other quite often in Aramaic. And we actually see some of that in the gospel accounts, which we've talked about. Hebrew was very much still in use in the synagogues, in the temple. The priests all knew about Hebrew, and the rabbis were able to teach Hebrew. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. But I want to focus in on something I think is interesting. So years ago, there came about amongst scholarly circles a discussion called the quest for the historical Jesus. And part of that movement was where there were a bunch of historical scholars who tried to get together and determine whether or not they thought what was written in the Bible actually happened. And, a lot of weird things came out of this particular movement, and a lot of good things came out of this particular movement. But specifically, there was a conversation that came out of this movement where you had some scholars who said, this part of the Gospels, I think Jesus really said that. And this other part of the Gospels, I don't think Jesus actually said that. And long story short, out of this conversation, there were some scholars who were skeptics who decided that we did not really have the words of Jesus because he probably originally taught everything in Greek, and now all we have are in Aramaic, and all we have now are Greek translations. Now, there's a whole lot we could say about all of that, but I do want you to be aware that where the quest for the historical Jesus landed was essentially in a very good place, where there was a lot of pushback by conservative scholars who were able to show and determine and make a strong, very powerful case that everything in your Gospels, Jesus actually said those things, okay? But what I'm bringing it up for this reason, that there are a lot of scholars who will say that Jesus originally taught everything in Aramaic and that all we have are Greek translations. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. There is a facet of that that's true if Jesus taught in Aramaic. But if Jesus taught in Greek, what do we have in our New Testament? What do we have? If Jesus taught in Greek much of the time, what do we actually have in our New Testament? The direct words of Jesus himself, do we not? I hope I'm getting across the importance of looking at something like this, though it sounds on the surface like a little bit of a strange study. But I want you to think about, let's take a moment and think about the popularity of Aramaic and Greek in Jesus' time. Okay, I've already mentioned Aramaic was now the native tongue amongst Jews. They have that because of the exile, Babylonian captivity. And we've already mentioned also that Greek is the common language across all the whole Mediterranean. However, Greek is very prevalent in also Galilee and Samaria and even in Judea, where Aramaic was also widespread. And so we also find Greek surprisingly used on Jewish ossuaries. Who can tell us what a Jewish ossuary is? Yeah, it's a burial box, essentially, right? And so what would happen is, you're familiar with how they would dress the body, and then over time, somebody would come back to the body, collect the bones, and then put them in essentially what was a bone box. And what's interesting is, on all of these Jewish ossuaries, guess what language is written on it? Not Aramaic, Greek. Showing that it is actually a very prevalent language being used here. John, your computer has died. Y'all were like, good. I was bored by that anyway. John, do you have a power cord? A power cord? I don't think so. All right, so we'll just pick it up over here. I'll give you a minute to get back onto that. Details, that's right. You'll have to probably hit the... All right, so everybody look on your page 7 there, and notice on Well, I think it's in the process of powering up or down, where it ran out of power. Yes, I think it just cut off. All right, now it's coming back on. All right, so over here you see everything we were just talking about. You have the Tanakh. Page 7 turns out to be an important page for us. But I'm trying to make the case essentially that the disciples and Jesus. So let's do a favor. I'll skip ahead, and then once we get here, we'll catch back up to it. So let's all turn in our Bible for a minute to John chapter 3. And what I want to do is really try to build a case that Greek is incredibly, used, prevalent by Jesus and the disciples. You got a password, John? You don't want me to type this in? All right, so let's just think about it for a minute. Well, I hope you know what it is. Oh, there it is. Is it your finger, really? Yeah. It takes like your fingerprint? Okay. All right, that'll work. Okay, so we'll just pick back up here then. We'll come to John in a minute as it's in order. So Greek names were used for cities and regions, and even personal names for some of the Jewish people. We'll skip 6 and come back to it in a minute. But number 7 is important because New Testament documents look like original compositions in Greek. What do I mean by that? Rather than translations. What do I mean by they look like original compositions in Greek? Rather than translations from Aramaic. What does that mean? They were first written in what language? Just to look at them, they look like they were first written in Greek. And so I think what we have is a big assumption by a lot of scholars, and you even hear this from some of our own brethren from time to time as they're making comments on gospel accounts or something. They'll say, this probably was originally written in Aramaic. And they'll just say it as a passing thing. And they don't even make a point about it. They just say it in passing. But I want us to see how prevalent and important Greek was. So let's look at just for a minute. This is an example of what we were just talking about, Jewish ossuaries. These are bone boxes used in burials. And so these, you see up here on the screen, a couple of examples of this. And you can even see on the one on the left side of the screen, these are capitalized. You might be able to make out some of what it looks like. Those are capital Greek letters. And so these date from the first half of the 1st century. Now, what is significant about this? Why am I showing you a bunch of burial boxes for bones? Well, if Jews were constantly talking and writing in Aramaic or Hebrew more than Greek, what should we expect to find on the ossuary box? Aramaic. But what do we find instead? Greek. That's very significant, I think. And there are more synagogue inscriptions in Greek, even in Palestine, than in Aramaic or Hebrew. Very interesting. And so this is one scholar, Vanderhorst, in Biblical Archaeology Review. He writes that 70%, get this, 70% of ossuary boxes are written in Greek, 12% are in Latin, 18% are in Hebrew and Aramaic. That's interesting. Did you ever know bone boxes could be interesting? I don't know if we're accomplishing that or not, but we're trying. Yes, Andrew? Yeah.
More, important to us.
Yes.
Kind of holy in a way.
Yeah.
I think that's why they have the Greek on there, because it's more of a sacred language, holy language.
I don't know. I think, well, first, I want to say that's a pretty good comparison. I like what you did there with the gravestone comparison, because on gravestones, we write things which they would have written on the sides of these ossuaries. I don't know that I would say that they thought Greek was more sacred. I think, if anything, they would have thought Hebrew was more sacred. But Greek was extremely common. And I think what that says is the prevalence and how deeply saturated Jewish culture was with Greek. And that's really where I'm headed in a direction with it. Very good comment. So Jesus and his disciples spoke Greek. I'm convinced of it, and it likely was very heavily influenced by Aramaic thought. So I want you to think about this for just a minute. Imagine you grew up, I don't know, is anybody here from like your first language, or you're from another country originally? Nobody here probably. I don't think anybody in here's got that. Let's say you're from, I don't know, Argentina. And let's just say, or you're from Spain, or you're from Portugal, or you're from, fill in the blank. And you learn very well the English language, but English is your what? It's your second language, right? And so a lot of times, even if you have learned English very, very well, you will speak English, but sometimes it comes out like it's Aramaic, right? Because your thought process might be in a different order, or you might have turns of phrase or figures of speech in your native language that then you try to bring it through in English as your second language. And really that's what we're seeing in the gospel accounts when we think that they're influenced by Aramaic. And so I think it makes sense to understand the gospels originally being written in Greek, not in Aramaic. So think about this just for a minute. Jesus and his disciples, their entire culture was now dominated by a Hellenistic culture, a Greek-influenced culture. Jesus' hometown was close to the Decapolis, the famous or infamous 10 cities. When was the story of the prodigal son? He goes, where does he go? He goes to the great cities and spends his father's inheritance to him in riotous living. And so Jesus would have grown up learning about Greek and Greek culture. And I think that's especially true if he had been engaged in the trade of carpentry with his father. Now, why do I say that? Well, carpentry in the time of Jesus, how do we think of carpenters? We think of them, they have a broad range of skills, but a lot of times we think of them as woodworkers. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I grew up thinking of carpenters as woodworkers primarily. I don't know why. In Jesus' time, they very much would have been more akin to stonemasons, because you're talking about them engaging in that kind of building and that kind of work. Not to say they couldn't do other things. It tells you a little bit about probably maybe the upbringing, earthly upbringing of Jesus. But Jesus is probably interacting with a lot of that. And so just think about his disciples likely also spoke Greek because they needed to conduct business as fishermen, as we'll see in just a minute, tax collectors. So it's important for us. I want us to understand how prevalent Greek was in the use of the scriptures. Now, in Jesus' time, we said this last week. See if you remember. In Jesus' time, which version of your Old Testament, their Hebrew Bible, which version did the common person use more than the other? The original Hebrew scriptures or the Septuagint? It was the Septuagint, by far. When you look in the New Testament, you guys are gold star all the way tonight. Y'all are doing great. When you look in the Greek New Testament and the authors or the speakers quote from the Old Testament, does the word order and choice of words match exactly, in most cases, the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint? Septuagint. Does that surprise you? That's exactly what it is. So, and I'll give you a couple examples here in just a minute. But we should really stop and think about the prevalence of the use of Greek in the scriptures of the people of God at the time of Jesus. Now, this is interesting. You ever heard of a guy named Rabbi Gamaliel? Anybody ever heard of this guy? Anybody heard of that guy? What do you know about him? One really important thing. There's a lot we could say about him. But what's the most important? Yeah, so Paul was originally a student of Gamaliel, a shining student of Gamaliel, by the way, for the positions and tasks that he was given. But we know from extra biblical writings that Gamaliel taught his students both Hebrew and Greek in order to interact with Roman authorities. Also, so that they would be very fluent in the Septuagint itself. His son Simeon reports that hundreds of Gamaliel's students immersed in Greek writings. They knew the writings of the poets, the cynics. They knew all of those Greek writings. The Talmud records 500 students of Greek and 500 students of Hebrew studying under Gamaliel. Is that a big number? That's incredible. Isn't that incredible? So just at a snapshot in time, you've got Gamaliel. He's got 500 Greek students, 500 Hebrew students. That's powerful to think about, okay? So Philo of Alexandria, or Philo. What did we say about Alexandria, by the way? Alexandria was the place where what was translated? Septuagint. And why was it there? More Jews there than anywhere else except for Jerusalem. So one of those guys, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher. What's the meaning behind these three words? Hellenistic, influenced by Greek culture. Jewish, philosopher. He's interacting with Socrates and Plato. He's a thoughtful guy. A lot of times you'll read journal articles, or I remember one time reading an article in the Gospel Advocate and somebody mentioned Philo. So he's a guy that's living in Alexandria at the time of Jesus and the beginning of the early church, okay? And when he writes of things that happened, events or lessons, he uses Hebrew thinking and then translates it into Greek. Are you getting what I'm saying? So you got words, concepts, word order, phrases, but it's kind of Hebrew thinking, but it's all in Greek. He's translating it all in Greek. And here's what he says about that. He refers to the Hebrew language as the Hebrew tongue, and then says our own language is Greek, even though he's a Jewish writer. Are you sufficiently bored yet? We're getting there. I know it. I'm sorry. But just think about what he's saying. He's writing at the time of Jesus. His entire background is as a Jew. And he says, yes, we honor the Hebrew language, but our language now is what? Our language now is Greek. Very popular Greek is in Jesus' day. Okay, let's look at Matthew 27. You see it on the screen. We've talked about it before. 27:46. This is the scene of the cross, 3 p.m. Jesus cries out with a loud voice, saying, El. Remember we had this study 2 weeks back? What's the word for El? What does it mean? El. E-L. It's the word for what? Generic term, God. Very good. El and Elohim. Elohim is a plural form of El. Lots of other words, Eloah. But El. And when you put the E ending here, Eli, that means my God. Okay? El, God, Eli, my God. And what does Jesus say at the cross? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, what? Where does this come from, scholars? Psalms. In Jesus' darkest hour, he quotes Scripture. Psalm 22, verse 1. And it's interesting because Psalm 22, verse 1 starts out in a moment of despair, continues forward in a moment of conquest and victory and vindication. Isn't that great? And I cannot help but think Jesus had all those things in mind as he's saying these words from the cross. Yes, he's crushed emotionally, but I think he's got the whole story in mind. Okay. But here, I just want to highlight, here in this text, we have a kind of rare occasion where our Greek Gospels record Aramaic words of Jesus, but he's not actually talking to another person. That's an important thing for us to think about. Let's look at Mark chapter 5 for a minute. Mark 5:22. In the Gospels, sometimes we find the inclusion and highlighting of certain phrases that are Aramaic phrases present in what are Greek Gospels, but we have these Aramaic phrases thrown in. All right, so somebody read for the class Mark 5:22, please. Read it loudly.
And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet
Continue.
and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live.
And what does Jesus say to her? What are the words that he uses?
Continue reading.
Yeah, you can. That's fine.
So Jesus went with him, and great multitude followed him and thronged him.
Yeah, sorry.
What verse you want? 41.
Yeah, okay, sorry. That's a
He
long
took the
way
child
down.
by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise.
Thank you for that. So it's verse 41. So as you look down in verse 41, here's a question I want to pose to you. If the Gospels were originally written in Aramaic, why do we have this interaction going on? Jesus is clearly saying an Aramaic phrase to this girl, but notice how it has to be explained in the context of a Greek Gospel. Which, do you hear what it says? It says, Talitha cum, which being translated means. So in other words, you have to have the Aramaic translated so that your Greek reader will understand. What does that tell you about the Gospel of Mark? Do you think it may have been originally written in Aramaic or Greek? I think it was very clearly here, we have an Aramaic meaning translated because it's originally written in Greek, which means we have the actual words of Jesus, not even a translation of it, spoken in this gospel account. That's what makes it so important. Let's think about another interaction. Jesus had conversations with a Roman centurion and a Syro-Phoenician woman. Now, question, scholars, do you think Jesus spoke Aramaic to a Roman centurion or to a Syro-Phoenician woman? Highly, highly unlikely. What was the common language all of them had, the three of them? Greek. So when you're reading this, understand that this is the direct words of Jesus as he's interacting with these individuals speaking Greek. Now, you're in John 3, which I asked you to go to a few minutes ago. John 3 is very interesting. So let's think about this. We have a very important religious figure in Jesus' day, member of the Sanhedrin. He has political and religious power. He's a man by the name of Nicodemus. And he comes to Jesus by night. There's theological and political things we could say about that, but we'll skip over it. He comes to Jesus by night and he says, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God. Why? For no man can do these things you're doing except God is with him. What does Jesus say? Thank you, Nicodemus. It's nice to meet you finally. And we can talk about things. Have you heard any of my teachings lately? Is this what Jesus says? What does he say? Verse 3. Somebody read it for the class.
Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God.
Okay, so is everybody looking at verse 3? All right, I want you to look at the words born again. And I want you to note, and it depends on what kind of Bible if you have a reference Bible or something of that nature, maybe you have a little mark after born again, or maybe you have a reference column and it has chapter 3, verse 3, and then it has something there, and it's going to give you an alternate translation to born again. Does anybody see that? Does anybody see that? Okay. So what is the alternate translation in some of your texts? From above. Anew. Okay. That's puzzling. That's puzzling. They're giving essentially a synonym rather than the other common meaning of the word. The first offering was better. The first offering was from above. So, genethe, anothen are the two words that Jesus uses. So, genethe has to do with birth, Anothen is our word here that's very, very interesting because anothen has a double meaning. Don't lose me here and don't get bored, okay? Anothen has a double meaning. Anothen can mean again, and it can also mean from above. And John, as an author in the Gospel of John, frequently uses words that have double meanings on purpose so that we will think about both meanings. And a really bad illustration of this I'll use. Does anybody ever remember looking at an amplified Bible? Anybody ever remember seeing an amplified Bible in the past? Are you familiar with what an amplified Bible is? Where it has a word and then it'll put brackets and give like every possible other definition of a Greek word, and it uses it all throughout it. That thing can be as bad as it can be good. What I'm trying to tell you here is that this word anothen has two basic meanings. John, the author of the gospel, by inspiration, on purpose uses the word anothen because he wants you to think about being born again from above. Not either or, but both and. Is everybody tracking with me? Everybody got me? Okay. Here's my point. If there was ever a conversation where you would expect two individuals to be talking in Aramaic to each other, it would be right here with Jesus and Nicodemus. But John's whole discussion where he records them, the whole discussion revolves around the meaning of this Greek word anothen, showing us that this conversation likely took place originally in Greek. Is anybody with me? Did I lose everybody? These two guys were talking in Greek. The whole conversation hinges around this word anothen. And so when we hear people, primarily skeptics, who say, we don't really have the words of Jesus, that is incorrect. That is incorrect. There is a skeptic you may have heard of. He's very, very prominent by the name of Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman will say that this conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus never took place because they must have been talking in Aramaic. And based solely on that theory, he dispenses with the entire conversation. And I want to tell you that it's so short-sighted. So short-sighted. All right, you guys are getting bored with this. So let's think of some other examples anyway, shall we? If we're bored, let's just lean into it, shall we? So let's think about the moments where Jesus is in the temptation. You think about Matthew's gospel, right? In the temptation narrative in Matthew chapter 4. Every time that the adversary comes to Jesus and gives him a particular temptation, whether it was like ancient Israel that was struggling with food in their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Jesus now has the temptation for what? Hunger. And what's the temptation? I'll turn these stones into what? Bread, like the manna of ancient Israel, right? And how does Jesus respond, not only to this temptation, but to all three of them? How does he respond? It is written. And he quotes from the Old Testament. In fact, all three of the quotations are from the book of Deuteronomy. And just take a wild guess, which version of the Hebrew Bible Jesus quotes from? The original Hebrew, or does it match exactly the spelling, order, and words used in the Septuagint? Which one? Yeah. I'm asking you leading questions, am I not? I'm just showing you how prevalent it was used. So you think about the conversation between Jesus and Pilate, Jesus being betrayed. This conversation did not happen in Latin. It's very unlikely. Do y'all remember that? Did y'all ever see the movie The Passion of the Christ? I think I watched it once. It's pretty rough to watch for a variety of reasons. I get equally frustrated and sad, watching it. Frustrated by stuff that's not in the Bible. like I do with every Bible movie, but then really moved by some of the stuff that's just so, wow, so intense and so hard to watch. I think they had the conversation between Jesus and Pilate being had in Latin. You remember that movie? It had subtitles almost, the whole way through with various languages. That conversation far more likely to have happened in Greek, because the conversing language of the Romans and for the Jews and for everyone in power was the Greek language. We also have unique words present in the Gospels, not found in contemporary Aramaic. I could really get into some of this. One very interesting section is Matthew 16. Do you remember the whole conversation by the coast of Caesarea Philippi? And you remember Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" What was their answer? Lots of options. Maybe even John the Baptist come back from the dead. And Jesus asked his disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter confesses. He makes the great confession, right? And then Jesus makes a declaration and says, "Upon this you are Peter, Petros, and upon this rock, Petra, I shall build my church." That whole phrase hinges on a play on words. Okay? You're a pebble, but on this bedrock confession, this huge boulder confession, I will build my church. It's a wordplay in Greek. Guess what? In Aramaic, there's no wordplay. It makes no sense. It doesn't work. And I've actually read commentators who said, well, this conversation probably originally took place in Aramaic, so this whole conversation about rock is null and void. Not at all. Not at all. There are other occasions where Jesus likely used Greek in his teaching, whether it's the Samaritan woman, the Pharisees, Herodians, on and on and on. We could go to Acts 2 and look at the Apostle Peter. When the Apostle Peter is giving his incredible sermon on the day of Pentecost, and he quotes from the Old Testament to boost his case of Jesus being the Messiah. And he quotes from Joel. He also quotes from Psalm 16. Guess what version of the Hebrew Bible he quoted from? Septuagint. Word for word. Wording identical. And here's what's interesting. Virtually every New Testament author, when they quote the Old Testament, they use the Septuagint. Okay? All right, so I could go on and on and on. We're running out of time, and this is pretty technical to begin with. I just want to say to you a few final thoughts. There are a lot of scholars who have argued that the Gospels and indeed the entire New Testament was written in Aramaic. I do not think that's the case. It makes no sense for the Apostle Peter writing first and write that document in Aramaic, and then somebody else to come along and do it. Makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense for Paul to write the book of Romans first in Aramaic. Where's it going again? The book of Romans? Not a trick question, right? It makes no sense for him to write in Aramaic first and then have it translated into Greek. I hope y'all see what I'm really belaboring the point about. So here is some manuscript evidence thoughts, just briefly, and I'll wrap this up. The Greek New Testament is the best attested set of ancient documents in existence. We have over 5,800 ancient Greek manuscripts totaling 2.6 million pages of biblical text surviving down to us to the present day. Would you say that that's a lot? That's a lot. And then we have other ancient manuscripts in Latin and Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, many other languages, over 10,000 in number. We have very famous fragments, which we'll talk about a little more, P90, P104, P98. That one on the upper right-hand corner is the oldest portion of the book of Revelation, by the way. Very interesting. P52 in the bottom right-hand corner, one of the oldest fragments of the New Testament. This is just a fragment. We're not talking about codices. We'll talk about what that means next week, where it's a book of them put together. This is the oldest fragment, called the Ryland Papyrus, p52 of the Gospel of John. We'll talk about these next week and that. And so right here, on this page, I have pictured for you all the ancient manuscript evidence that we have of the Gospels originally being written in Aramaic. Are you with me? So for all of these scholars and skeptics who say that they were originally written in Aramaic, take a wild guess how many ancient manuscripts in Aramaic we have in our possession. 0. Absolutely 0. So what can we take away from all of this? And some of you probably got a good nap. Okay, I get it. And next week we'll get into manuscripts and we'll be building towards, some of the earliest Bible versions. This is the history of the Bible. But it was interesting to do this because I want us to realize what you have before you. Think about it. That book, there's no other book like it. You already knew that. But just in terms of its transmission from the time it was written to the present time, there's no ancient document like it. And it was, by all evidence we have, written in Koine Greek. And you have then not a translation of a translation of a translation. You have the actual words of Jesus in that book sitting before you. That's the important thing for you to know, whether the details were interesting or not. All right, any questions or comments before we close out? Yes, we're done, believe it or not. See what I spared y'all with? Look at all this other stuff we could have talked about. Okay. Hey, you guys are very patient tonight. It was a little bit of a different class. We'll get back into some more recognizable stuff next week. Thank you for your patience and your attention and your participation. Let's close out with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we come before you. We're so very thankful for your preservation of the words of your Son, for the preservation of the words of your prophets, the preservation of the words of the apostles, the very words that you yourself have spoken. And so we thank you for that. What a gift it is for our lives to have those things written down. May we cherish those words. May they transform us. It's in the name of Jesus we ask it. Amen. Y'all have a great rest of the week. Part of